students in the massive open online course on comparative democratic development. We have a few questions this week that I'd like to answer. One concerns accountability institutions and how they might be structured. What are case studies of better or worse accountability structures found in different democracies? We're going to get into this at some quite considerable detail in the second part of the course when we look at political institutions and different ways of structuring institutions of horizontal accountability. The questioner asks, should judges be elected, and if so, by whom? I'll just say briefly now, I think it's a really, really bad idea in any democracy to elect judges. Judges should be faithful to the rule of law. They should be well trained. They shouldn't be chosen by popular approval or by popularity or by partisan orientation. Obviously, they can be selected by presidents or prime ministers who nominate them because of a certain judicial philosophy, particularly for the Constitutional Court. But I think most judges need to be really non-political and depoliticized. And I think no trial judge or even appellate judge should ever have to stand for election before the voters. That is not the way to develop a strong rule of law and an independent judiciary. And I think it's a big mistake in the United States that so many of our judges do have to stand for election and then raise campaign funding, which immediately disposes them to potential conflict of interest with people who might come before them or interests that might come before them on the judicial bench. What are some case studies of better or worse accountability structures in different democracies? We're going to get into this in part 2 of the class when we look at agencies of horizontal accountability. But let me just say for now that I think that there's some very creative new institutions that have been created in recent democracies, such as the Office of the Public Protector in South Africa, which did play a role in limiting ultimately and raising public alarm about the abuse of power by President Jacob Zuma. So the questioner then goes on to ask a very astute question about the balance of effectiveness between horizontal accountability and vertical accountability. And unfortunately, there is some evidence to suggest that without effective vertical accountability, horizontal accountability can be overridden, can be stripped away or eroded, can be degraded. So these two do work in tandem, and we're going to get into that issue as well as we enter part 2 of the class. Now, I'd like to just briefly address the question, is democracy good for the poor? And here I will say that we're going to get into this in more detail as well when we ask, is democracy a universal value? I strongly urge all of you to read the article by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen that addresses this question very eloquently and I think makes a persuasive case that democracy is no less important for poor people than it is for others, and that poor people need the protection for their political rights in order to help them secure their economic and social rights. There's a question about Venezuela. I couldn't stop thinking about my own country, Venezuela, the questioner says. which in my opinion is not any longer even an electoral democracy. That is certainly true. Venezuela ceased to be an electoral democracy quite some time ago. And I think now it used to be a competitive authoritarian regime. I'm not even sure, but the level of intimidation and brutality that's being visited on the country by the Chavista regime and the president, Nicolas Maduro, I'm not even sure we can call it a competitive authoritarian regime anymore. The last question is whether democracy should be defined, or why it came to be defined as selfish individualism. I don't think this is any kind of equivalence. First of all, you can have strong protection for individual rights and have a strong commitment to the community, which means that it's not selfish. And indeed, I think the reason why a strong sense of national pride, national identity, even what we call civic nationalism, is very important for liberal democracy, is precisely because there has to be an emphasis on shared values that transcends the concern for individual rights and the maximization of individual utility. That's never enough in a quality democracy, and it's not enough to hold a liberal democracy together in difficult times. So I recommend to you some of the articles we've published in the Journal of Democracy, including a recent one by the Georgian democratic scholar and intellectual Gia Nodia that gets into this to some extent. I do very much hope you'll continue to send your questions and comments, and I will try to respond to them each week. Thank you.